Coming out of his cage and he's been doing some crime. Loot is the latest Marmite of the Magic the Gathering player base. You either love the fuzzy little guy and his slightly deranged expressions, or you believe he is emblematic of everything that's wrong with modern Magic and want to see him travel through an omen path straight into a wood chipper. Either way, since he first crawled out of the Fomori Vault Margtara now on Thunder Junction, he's already had 3 cards. The Key to Everything in the Big Score bonus sheet, Exuberant Explorer in Foundations, and most recently, the Pathfinder in Aetherdrift. The Key to Everything is a 1/2 with Ward 1, of course, and at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of card types among other non-land permanents you control. You may play those cards this turn. A potentially pretty strong impulse draw effect that can generate additional value with cards like Delayed Blast Fireball, Passionate Archaeologist, and Wild Magic Sorcerer. Loot Exuberant Explorer depicts a bigger bootied loot, a 1/4/4 green and 2 generic that allows you to play an additional land on each of your turns, and pay 2 green, 4 generic, and tap him to look at the top 6 cards of your library, then reveal a creature card with a mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control from among them, and put it onto the battlefield. This iteration allows you to essentially ramp your way to cheating out big boys at a pretty premium rate, but it's green. There's always a creature that costs more than 6 mana. But this latest loot, well, here's where things get interesting. He's strong. Really strong. To the point where he's seeing interest as a CEDH commander, and that when you start putting together a list on Moxfield, the EDH Rex section is full of all of the Temur good stuff staples that you'd expect to see. For Temur and 2 generic, Loot the Pathfinder is a hasty, double-striking Vigilant 2/4 with 3 activated abilities that each have exhaust, because cars. For green and tapping, you make 3 mana of any one color, for blue and tapping, you draw 3 cards, and for red and tapping, you deal 3 damage to any target. So, a one-time Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, and Lightning Bolt? Pretty sweet, huh? As everyone who's excited about this card has probably already told you, exhaust abilities can only be activated once, but you can reset this if Loot leaves the battlefield by blinking, bouncing, recasting, etc, etc. For this reason, you can win the game with Loot if you have a Deadeye Navigator on board. Pair Loot with Navigator with Soulbond, giving them both the ability to blink for the price of blue and 1 generic, pay a green and tap to activate Loot's first ability for 3 blue, blink Loot, repair, pay a green to make your 3 green, and repeat for infinite mana. From there you can use your infinite blue and green to make infinite red to bolt down the table for a win. So when I pulled this shiny Loot here, I wanted to build a deck for him, but I definitely didn't want to just build a not quite CEDH list that would likely be a bit much for casual tables and not nearly enough for higher power. At first I thought about taking advantage of those keywords to turn Loot into kind of a high value Voltron commander and even built a working list for this, but it wasn't quite inspired enough for my tastes. It was there that I thought that we could take this little idol of modern Magic to an even more obnoxious place. It was there that the idea for the Loothater's Guide to the Galaxy was born. Bruh. We're doing attractions, baby!
Ring a ding, baby.
Attractions were introduced in 2022's Unfinity, a not entirely illegal unset that was also a bit hit or miss with the player base. Attractions are artifacts that live in their own little side deck of at least 10 for constructed formats, from which you put a random one into play whenever an effect instructs you to open an attraction. At the beginning of your first main phase, you roll a d6 to visit your attractions, then all with a light that matches your result trigger, with all printed attractions triggering on a roll of 6. There are 22 Commander legal attractions, so let's have a look at them, shall we? All of the following trigger on a roll of 2. Balloon Stand has you choose to either create a 1/1 red balloon creature token with flying, or pay the cost of sacrificing a balloon to give target creature flying until end of turn. Bounce Chamber returns the creature with the lowest toughness among creatures you don't control to its owner's hand. Clown Extruder creates a 1/1 Clown Robot artifact creature token, and Concession Stand creates a food token. Foam Weapons Kiosk puts a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control and also gives Vigilance until end of turn. Hall of Mirrors has you choose a target creature you control, then all other creatures you control become a copy of it until end of turn, except they aren't legendary if the chosen creature is legendary. Information Booth has you draw a card, Merry-Go-Round gives creatures you control with power 2 or less horsemanship until end of turn, and Roller Coaster gives creatures you control +2/+0 until end of turn. Swinging Ship adds an additional combat phase after the first combat phase, at the beginning of which creatures that attack that turn untap. Trash Bin has you mill 2 cards, then return a random card from your graveyard to your hand, and Tunnel of Love has you choose an opponent, who chooses a creature they control, and then you choose a creature you control. You may then exile those cards, after which they return to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step, or they fight. The joke is that they're like a couple, and you get to choose whether they get on or not. It's cute. Our next badge trigger on a roll of 2 or 3. Bumper Cars forces target creature to be blocked this turn. Costume Shop has you put a sticker on a non-land permanent you control. Drop Tower gives target creature flying until end of turn, or a player rolls a 1, whichever comes first. Fortune Teller has you scry 1. Kitty Coaster gives creatures you control +1/+0 until end of turn. And Spinny Ride taps a target creature an opponent controls. Pick a Beeble has you roll another d6, then put a number of luck counters on it equal to the result, where then if there are 6 or more luck counters on it, you claim the prize, which is to create 2 treasure tokens, sacrifice Pick a Beeble, and open a new attraction. Then we've got a couple of roll outliers. Storybook Ride has you exile the top X cards of your library on a 2, 5, or 6, where X is the number of attractions you visited this turn, including itself, then lets you play those cards this turn, with the added benefit that if any of them remain in exile at the beginning of the next end step, you put them on the bottom of your library in any order. Ferris Wheel triggers on a 4, 5, or 6, and has you phase out target creature that hasn't been phased out with it already, which then stays phased out until you roll a 3 or lower while visiting your attractions. And Haunted House has you return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield on a 3 or 6, then exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So we've got a whole host of effects that can offer utility to different game plans. The ones that really shine with loot, however, are Hall of Mirrors, which will let us turn our entire board into non-legendary loots, each with their own set of exhaust abilities, and Swinging Ship, which, given I'm not entirely abandoning the Voltron game plan, will let us take extra combats to get even more hits in. Tunnel of Love is a nice flicker effect. That's flicker in the flicker wisp sense, not the flicker sense. If a little less than ideal with loot, because we'll miss him not being around during our turn if we want to swing or need mana or draw, but it's a good backup if we've already exhausted all of his abilities, and failing that we can use it to take out an opponent's creature. Otherwise I'm going to be running Bounce Chamber for the free removal, Drop Tower and Merry-Go-Round for the extra evasion, Fortune Teller to help us sculpt our draws, Haunted House for some recursion potential, Information Booth, Storybook Ride and Trash Bin for more kind of functional draw, Roller and Kitty Coaster for the damage buffs, Spinny Ride as a bit of tap down, and Pick a Beeble for some extra ramp. This was essentially a combination of what I viewed as the must-run attractions with the attractions I already owned because I didn't want to be ordering an excessive amount of singles. I do my best to build with what I have. So, we've looked at the attractions that look like great support pieces for a loot deck, but beyond being annoying, why else do we want to run them? Well, of the 9 cards in Teamer colors that have us open an attraction, 6 of them do it on ETB. And if we're going to be running blink effects to keep resetting loot's abilities, we might as well cash in on that too, right? So given that there's only 9 cards in our color identity that open attractions, we're running them all. 2 of these are sorceries. For green and 2 generic, Coming Attraction has us go find a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then open an attraction. while for 1 generic and 1 blue, command performance gives us the choice of 2 of opening an attraction, rolling to visit our attractions, getting 2 tickets, and putting a sticker on a non-land permanent we own. We don't care about the last 2, but being able to get another attraction on board and potentially hit some extra visit triggers is definitely worth it. Myra the Magnificent is a 2/4 for Is It and 2 that has us open an attraction whenever we cast an instant or sorcery from our hand. We can also pay X and tap her to exile an instant or sorcery from our graveyard and put a midway counter on an attraction we control that doesn't have a midway counter on it. Whenever we then visit that attraction, we can copy the exiled card and cast the copy without paying its mana cost. This can be really good value for us, as when we cast our cheap blink spells, we get an attraction as a bonus. Then we give ourselves a chance to recast those spells when we roll for our attractions, either resetting Loot if we've already exhausted him, or simply re-triggering our creatures which open attractions on ETB. Let's have a look at these. Draconian Gatebot is a 4/2 robot artifact creature for 5 generic that has us either open an attraction or destroy target attraction when it enters. You know, for all the other attractions decks at the table. Monitor is a 2/5 human employee for blue and 2 that also lets us pay 1 generic to re-roll 1 or more dice once per turn, which might occasionally save us from a whiff. Petting Zookeeper is a 0/4 elf employee with reach, a keyword that should never be underestimated, for green and 2 generic. Rad Rascal is a 3/3 devil employee, we all know a few of those, for red and 3. Seasoned Buccaneer is a 2/2 Vidalcan employee for blue and 2, and finally Squirrel Squatters is a 4/4 for green and 3 generic. Squirrel Squatters is a 4/4/4/4. Why did I write that sentence? Which has the added benefit of creating a tapped and attacking 1/1 squirrel for each attraction we've visited that turn when it attacks. It is also a squirrel. None of these stat lines are going to blow you away for their cost, but this is the price we must pay if we wish to run away and join the circus.
I have a lot of friends.
Now, to help power out our attractions and Loot himself, we're running a pretty big ramp package in this deck. Arcane Signet, Birds of Paradise, Felwar Stone, and Soul Ring all tap for extra mana. 3 visits lets us go find a forest alongside coming attraction, and Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth both make our lands tap for extra mana as well. We're also running Ruby Medallion, Sapphire Medallion, and Goblin and Archomancer to bring our costs down, as well as Patriarch's Seal, which for 3 generic taps for a mana of any color, as well as letting us pay 1 generic and tap it to untap a legendary creature we control to get an extra activation out of Loot each turn cycle. For more untapping, we're also running the Onslaught Classic Affetto Alchemist, a 1/2 human wizard for blue and 1 generic that we can tap to untap a target artifact or creature. He also has Morph for blue. This is honestly an underrated card that I didn't realize I had until I was thumbing through a stack of cards I was given in a Dragon Shield sleeve box labeled Cards Old Enough to Drink, and it has a home in basically any deck that cares about tap abilities. And while we're on the subject of untapping, we're also running Shore Up, which gives +1/+1 and hexproof until end of turn in case anyone tries to snipe our precious boy. To further support the treasure creation from Pickabeeble, we're also running Guild Artisan, which for 1 generic and a red gives our commander the triggered ability to create 2 treasures whenever it attacks our opponent with the highest life total. This is particularly great with Loot, as due to his haste we can trigger it the turn he hits the table, and then use a treasure to activate any of his abilities. We're also running Goldspan Dragon for even more treasures and more mana from those treasures. Yes, I'm being greedy here, but if you're not getting it already, this deck is much higher in the goof axis than it is on the competitive one. So I mentioned this is a Voltron list, at least in part. The first equipment that came to mind for me for its synergy with Loot is Sting the Glinting Dagger, which costs 2 to play and 2 to equip. It gives +1/+1 and untaps the equipped creature at the beginning of each combat. It also gives the creature first strike as long as it's blocking or being blocked by a goblin or orc, but that is much less important and rather redundant with Loot. Really, we want that untap to be able to activate all of Loot's abilities per turn cycle, for, and importantly, to be able to use them in our first main phase and still be able to swing with loot. Next, we have the Sword of Hearth and Home, which for 3 generic and 2 to equip, gives the equipped creature +2/+2, protection from green and white, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may exile 1 target creature you own, search your library for a basic land, then put both onto the battlefield. This gives Loot a good stat buff, particularly given he's got double strike, protection from cheap white spot removal that is often the bane of 4 mana plus commanders, and lets us blink our attraction creatures, or if needed, Loot himself, while also ramping us even further. We've also got Sword of the Animist, which provides a bit less upside, giving just +1/+1 and a tapped basic for the lesser cost of 2 and 2, but it does have the benefit of triggering on attack rather than having to deal damage. Loot is a great Basilisk Collar candidate, don't be weird, which for 1 generic to cast and 2 to equip gives Death Touch and Lifelink, disincentivizing our opponents blocking him and helping keep our life total up. This works great with Loot's red exhaust ability, letting us gain life and remove creatures where needed. We're obviously running Hammer of Nazan in this list, which for 4 generic gives +2/+0 and indestructible, as well as letting us automatically attach other equipment to Loot if it's already on the battlefield. Given that we're going to be bouncing or flickering Loot at least a bit, having this out is going to save us a lot of mana on attachment costs, where otherwise we'd be paying to re-equip every time. This is admittedly the weakness of building Loot as a Voltron commander, but it's part of the fun figuring out the best ways to sequence our plays so that we don't completely screw ourselves, right? And what's a Voltron list without Helm of the Host? For 4 mana and 5 to equip, we create a non-legendary token copy of the equipped creature at the beginning of our combat. So that's more loots and more activations. To help protect loot, we're running Champion's Helm, which for 3 and 1 gives +2/+2, and as long as the equipped creature is legendary, hexproof. To better help Loot actually deal combat damage, we've also got Loxodon Warhammer, the Reaver Cleaver, and Rancor. Loxodon Warhammer gives +3/+0, Trample, and Lifelink for 3 and 3. The Reaver Cleaver gives +1/+1, Trample, and creates treasure tokens equal to the damage whenever we hit a player or planeswalker for 1 red and 2 generic and 3 to equip. And Rancor is just about the only aura that makes sense in this list, as it returns to hand whenever it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, i.e. when it inevitably falls off Loot, and otherwise gives +2/+0 and Trample for a green. And because it's incredibly fun giving this tiny little guy even more huge weapons, Excalibur Sword of Eden costs 12 generic, which is reduced by X, where X is the total mana value of historic permanents we control. We can pay 2 to equip it to a legendary creature we control, which it then gives +10/+0 and Vigilance. Yes, the Vigilance is redundant, but swinging for 24 commander damage is the only way I can truly feel alive. Considering these equipments with the extra value from our attractions, as well as Loot's built-in keywords and stat line, we get a downright terrifying little fur baby with hands to make Rocky blush. One of the inherent weaknesses of Voltron lists is that often you can only take out 1 player in a turn, given that you've got all your power on 1 creature. Yes, we've got 1 source of extra combats already from Swinging Ship, but we are going to be running a few more to give ourselves a better chance of closing out games. The first of these is Great Train Heist from Loot's debut set, Outlaws of Thunder Junction. An instant with Spree for 1 red, it has 3 additional costs. Untap all creatures you control. If it's your combat phase, there is an additional combat phase after this phase for red and 2. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and first strike until end of turn for 2 generic, and choose target opponent. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to that player this turn, create a treasure token for red. This is particularly great with Loot, as we can attack with him, then pay some of the cost by activating his first ability for 3 mana, then untap him and get to swing again in an additional combat. The additional power and treasure generation are nice extras that we can add on if we've got the mana to pay for them. Next, we've got Last Night Together from Doctor Who, a sorcery for red, green, and 3 that has us choose 2 target creatures, untap them, and put 2+1/+1 counters on each of them. They gain Vigilance, Indestructible, and Haste until end of turn, and after the current main phase, there is an additional combat phase during which only the chosen creatures can attack. 2 of these keywords are redundant in Loot's case, but making him indestructible for the turn, as well as basically doubling his base power with 2 counters, is pretty great. Additionally, if your other chosen creature is the aforementioned Goldspan Dragon, then this spell essentially pays for itself. The last of our additional combat spells just had to be Full Throttle from Ether Drift, a sorcery for red, and 4 generic, which gives 2 additional combats and depicts the little goober in all his glory. All of these help us set up for big turns that hopefully see us hitting our opponents for lethal, and if we cast 1 or more but don't quite connect, don't forget we can use Myra's ability to tie them to our attractions and potentially try again. It's also worth mentioning here that this list does include Enter the Enigma, a sorcery for blue that makes a target creature unblockable until end of turn and draws us a card. This is otherwise known as a cantrip, which is fantastic paired with any additional combat effects. So now we've covered the full hand hitting part of the deck, let's have a look at flickering. Flickerizing. As I've already said, the value of flicker and bounce effects in this deck are twofold, resetting loot or opening additional attractions with ETBs. It's also kind of the only form of protection we're running for loot beyond a couple of the equipments we've already covered. The 2 flicker effects that we're running that don't offer any protection value due to being sorcery speed are both from Bloomburrow. Splash Portal flickers a creature we control and draws us a card if it was a bird, frog, otter, or rat. Oh well. And Lily Splash Mentor is a 4/4 frog druid with reach for green, blue, and 2 generic, and the ability to flicker a creature we control, as well as giving it a +1/+1 counter for 1 generic and Simic. This guy is actually seeing at least a little bit of play at higher power levels, given it's a 2-card infinite mana combo with Peregrine Drake. Hence we are not playing Peregrine Drake. We are running 1 infinite combo, however, and that's Hullbreaker Horror, Soul Ring, and a 0 mana cost artifact. Not very inspired, I know, but I had to run this given you can make infinite clown robots with Clown Car. Come on! Clown Car is a vehicle with crew 2 for X mana that has you roll X dice when it enters, creating a 1/1 clown robot for each odd result, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Clown Car for each even result. You could play this as an X = 0 for infinite colorless mana, but given that it actually does something when we cast it for 1, we can do this instead. For the uninitiated, with Hullbreaker Horror out, you tap Soul Ring for 2 mana, play Clown Car for 1, bounce Soul Ring back to your hand, play it with your remaining 1 mana, bouncing Clown Car, and repeat. The 50-50 odds of creating a clown robot are irrelevant here, given that you can take the set of actions as many times as you like as long as no one stops you. So make as many as your heart desires, whether that's 42,
69,
420, or your Balatro high score. This combo can win outright if we also have Impact Tremors.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Which would deal 1 damage to each opponent for each clown robot's ETB, or Brazen Dwarf, a 1/3 dwarf shaman for red and 1 that deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever we roll 1 or more dice. We could also additionally make infinite flyers with Feywild Trickster, a 2/2 gnome warlock for blue and 2 that creates a 1/1 fairy dragon whenever we roll 1 or more dice. We do have another 1-cost artifact in this list that we could bounce and replay infinite times, and that's Glasses of Urza, which I am running because the funniest game action that you can take is looking at your opponent's hand and then proceeding to do absolutely nothing with that information, times infinity. Also because I know Alice Blackblade, a fellow loot enjoyer, would like that they're here. At least I can have a little peek at opponents' hands to know if they have any interaction. Nice. I'm proud of you. For instant speed flicker, we've got Blur, Essence Flux, Ghostly Flicker, and Planar Incision. Blur has the added bonus of drawing us a card for 2 in blue, and Essence Flux is the cheapest of the bunch at just a blue mana and gives a +1/+1 counter if the creature is a spirit. Both Ghostly Flicker and Planar Incision have the added benefit of being able to target artifacts, which can help us cheat equip costs with Hammer of Nazan or have something re-enter untapped, with Ghostly Flicker hitting 2 targets with the additional option of targeting lands for blue and 2, while Planar Incision only hits 1 with the bonus of a +1/+1 counter for 1 generic less. For repeatable sources of flicker, we're running everyone's favorite nuisance, Displacer Kitten. For blue and 3 generic, we get a 2/2 cat beast with the ability Avoidance, which flickers a non-land permanent we control whenever we cast a non-creature spell. This lets us essentially get an extra target on any flicker spells, cheats equips at instant speed with Hammer of Nazan, and keeps resetting loot, as well as opening more attractions. The much less obnoxious version of this is Conjurer's Closet, which for 5 generic mana lets us flicker a creature on each of our end steps. Yes, we're going back in. Finally, we've got 2 options for bouncing to hand as opposed to flicker, which are Cloudstone Curio and Retraction Helix. Cloudstone Curio is an artifact for 3 mana that lets us return a permanent that shares a card type whenever a non-artifact enters under our control. This works well with loot, as if he enters when we control Curio and one of the 3-cost attraction openers, we can bounce the creature back to hand, then immediately recast it with loot's first ability if we've got 1 green mana available. Retraction Helix is a 1-cost instant that gives a target creature the ability to tap to return a target non-land permanent to its owner's hand until end of turn. This is particularly useful in case someone tries to use a form of removal that we can't dodge with flicker, like a board wipe. So we've just a few cards left to cover in our Nightmare Circus, and these are the slight outliers from everything we've covered already, whether that's due to being little extra sources of certain effects, or, you know, the whole concept of removal. Double Major is an instant for green and blue that copies a target creature spell we control, except the copy isn't legendary if the spell is, so an extra loot if we've got the mana available, or maybe Myra if we're feeling fancy. Of course, we've also got Phyrexian Metamorph, a 0/0 artifact creature for 3 generic and a Phyrexian blue that we may have enter the battlefield as a copy of any artifact or creature on the battlefield, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. I don't know about you, but the idea of turning a monstrosity of Phyrexian ingenuity into a fairground ride is particularly funny to me. It's not even that bad a play if we have Swinging Ship on board for another source of extra combats, but we'll probably choose something else if our options are limited to the Hall of Mirrors or Merry-Go-Round. We've got 2 more creatures with good ETB effects, and that's Archaeomancer and Atali Primal Conqueror. Archaeomancer costs blue and 2 and returns an instant or sorcery from our graveyard to our hand when it enters, so we can get back some of our flicker or combat spells. And Atali has each player exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, from which we may cast any number of spells without paying their mana costs for red, and 5. Yes, we can repeat this with our other sources of flicker, and stealing other people's stuff is fun. We can also pay a Phyrexian green and 9 to transform Atali into an 11/11 with trample, indestructible, and the ability to give any player that he deals combat damage to that many poison counters, which is also really fun. We are running just 2 pieces of spot removal in Chaos Warp and Resculpt, and just 1 counterspell, Reverse the Polarity, which is actually here because it can make creatures unblockable for a turn. Look, we're just playing gas, live a little. Tandem Lookout is a 2/1 human scout with Soul Bond, which draws us cards whenever it or the creature it's paired with deal damage of any kind to a player. So we can use Loot Bolt to draw some cards as well if needed. Finally, no Attractions deck would be complete without Gamble, or as it's otherwise known, Entomb with extra steps. This is a deck that is meant to take a strong commander in loot and a strong play pattern in flicker, and just tone it down a little for a more casual take on how you can play them. The chance element of die rolling that comes with attractions really takes this deck to a space where it's hard to call its bracket. On a good day, it's probably pushing a 3, but with some rolls and it might crash down to a 1. Does that make it a foam too? Either way, I'm looking forward to jamming this at a range of tables and really just enjoying some silliness. And I hope you enjoyed hearing about the thought process behind this. I do seek to innovate in the realm of deck building irreverence, and this is a new favorite. And hey, when Edge of Eternities rolls around later this year, I might even get some fun, flavorful includes. Thanks as always for watching. Do you have an attractions deck? Which ones do you like the most, and who's the commander? And just how do you feel about this fuzzy little menace to society? Let me know in the comments below, and if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe, I'll return to the battlefield under my owner's control. See you next time.